I'm sure most of you already know this, but we recently leased a Chevy Blazer EV for our next long-term test vehicle. What you may not know, however, is that the Cadillac Lyriq is really the model that I wanted. And the main reason we got the Blazer instead of the Cadillac was, of course, the price tag. So in this video, let's talk about what you do get for the extra cash in the Cadillac, and of course, basically talk about the one that got away and why I still think that the Lyriq is a better EV than the Chevy, as long as you can afford one, of course. The Lyriq is not the first vehicle to be built on GM's Ultium platform, and this is perhaps where we should start this video. Because when GM says Ultium platform, they really mean a number of different platforms all under the Ultium umbrella. The first was the Hummer truck, we also have the Hummer SUV, the Silverado, etc., etc. But this does not share very much outside of the electronics with those bigger Ultium vehicles. So the suspension, the body design, crash structures, etc. are all obviously unique to the Lyriq. This is closely related to the Chevy Blazer, and like the Blazer EV, it is significantly wider than many of the competition that you might want to cross-shop this against. So if you're looking at something like a Kia EV6 or a Hyundai Ioniq 5, or of course a Tesla Model Y, this is a bigger vehicle. Most notably, it's wider. It's about 4 inches wider than a Model Y, about 2 inches wider than the 3-row Model X. So the Lyriq is not a small EV. You want to check this out if you're looking for something a bit bigger, a bit roomier, and of course, more stylish. Because I have to say, one of the reasons I really liked the Lyriq and wanted one instead of the Blazer is the design. I love the animated lights up front. I like the look of this. I just like the general design that we find in modern Cadillacs. The Lyriq isn't just wider than most of the competition, it's also longer than most of the competition at 196.7 inches long. Some of that clearly is this long hood proportion, which is definitely a little bit more form over function because we don't have any storage capacity under that hood. We'll get to that in just a moment. But when you look at this, you'll notice a few things. The first is it kind of has a station wagon-y vibe, if I'm perfectly honest. We have a relatively low roofline, certainly lower than we find in a BMW iX, and we have a sportback, liftback hatch thing going on back here. You can see that the hatch starts right in that area, and it's a little bit more horizontal than it is vertical, although it does actually go quite down on the rear bumper. And then we have the taillight modules that stretch all the way from the side right back there to the very rear of the vehicle. It's a really cool design, and I'm certainly a fan of station wagons, so that's probably why I gravitate a little bbit more to this design than what we see in some of the competition. Now, competition. Obviously, we have Polestar 3, EQE SUV, iX, Q8 e-tron, ZDX, which is closely related to this. It's the Acura version of this in essence, and of course that Chevy Blazer. Now, on the Tesla side of things, what does this compete with? I would argue that it's more the 2-row version of the Model X, which is about 2 inches longer than this and a little bit more upright, and not really the Tesla Model Y, because the Model Y doesn't feel as premium inside. This certainly feels a little bit nicer as far as some of the materials, but importantly, the dimensions and the size of this are different as well. It's significantly longer than a Model Y. We have more legroom on the inside, and we have a much wider cabin, which certainly gives this a different feel and a different experience inside. The Lyriq's long wheelbase doesn't just give this the elegant proportion we see here, it also enables it to have more interior room than we find in the vast majority of the competition. Rear passengers' heads are going to be right about here, which is why this is not a pillar. This is actually an additional window for those rear passengers to look out of. From the rear passenger area to the front of the vehicle, it's much longer than average. I measured it out, and it's about 8 inches longer from the firewall to the backs of the rear seats than a Model Y. That's a pretty big difference, and it's all down to the wheelbase and the motor position. Because the wheelbase is so long, it means that the motor is further up front for the front motor, and the rear motor is further in the back, just really stretching out that passenger compartment. Moving to the rear of the Lyriq, I get a bit more of a sportback vibe than necessarily station wagon vibe, but check out this taillight. It is absolutely enormous. This light pipe starts over here, wraps all the way around to the middle of that hatch. It's about 55 inches long. Cadillac is definitely known for big lighting elements, and the Lyriq is no different than the rest of the lineup, except that this lighting element is interestingly more on the side than it is on the back, and that's why we have another really huge taillight module down there at the bottom. If you're looking for something with excess in terms of light pipes, you definitely want to check out the Lyriq. There's also a third brake light right up here. It's kind of a little vertical tiny one in the middle, and this is a functional spoiler. Air goes in right there, comes out there. However, it is pretty difficult to clean. I'm not exactly clear how you'd really get your hand all the way in there to make sure that was completely clean. Certainly keep that in mind. Now remember I said there is more than just one Ultium platform. The one that underpins the Silverado, the upcoming Escalade IQ, and of course the Hummers, that one was designed for a front trunk to live under the hood. The one that underpins this and the Optic was not. So under this panel, we don't find a frubby or a frunk or anything along those lines. Instead, we find a lot of the electronic control systems for the EV drivetrain. So the AC charger, the 12-volt battery, the heat pump system, all of that is located under this front area. I am a little bit sad by that. I think that GM could have packaged things a little bit differently to give us at least a little bit of storage area under here, not for anything big, but for charge adapters, because those are certainly going to be a way of life in North America for a while. When J3400 really breaks out on the scene and we start seeing a proliferation of that standard, you're going to want to have J3400 adapters around, and here there's nowhere to put them easily. They're going to be back there in your trunk, under your luggage, rolling around, etc. Let's talk about the drivetrain now. Again, rear-wheel drive is where things start. 340 horsepower, 325 pound-feet of torque. You'll notice that General Motors seems to be a little bit cautious on the torque output figures in some of their EVs, at least for the moment. That's going to give you 314 miles of electric range. The all-wheel drive model adds a smaller electric motor under here, giving you 500 horsepower total and 450 pound-feet of torque. Although now you can bump that up to 524 pound-feet of torque via an over-the-air upgrade. That's going to cost a little over $1,000, and it's going to shave nearly half a second off your 0 to 60 time. Both the rear-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive model are powered by the same battery pack, and depending on the spec sheet you look at, the battery capacity ranges from around 100 kilowatt hours to 105 kilowatt hours. It's basically half the battery pack that we find in the Hummer EV. Instead of being a double-stacked 400, 800-volt pack, this is a nominal 400-volt pack, single-stacked with basically the same modules. And that's why this is not going to charge quite as quickly as the Hummer or, of course, the Escalade IQ. Charging happens behind door number 1 over here on the front quarter panel. This uses a CCS charge connector, of course. General Motors has committed to the NACS or J3400 charge connector, but we don't know exactly when that's going to happen on the Lyriq. If you're cross-shopping the Lyriq against some of the other Ultium EVs on sale in the US, here's some things to keep in mind. The Acura ZDX, it's basically an Acura Lyriq. It uses the same motors and same batteries as this model, so charging performance and 0 to 60 performance are largely the same. The Chevy Blazer is a bit different because you can get the Blazer as a rear-wheel drive vehicle with this same battery pack, or you can get it as an all-wheel drive vehicle with different motors and a smaller battery pack. That smaller battery pack charges significantly slower than this pack, just due to the number of modules. Also, the all-wheel drive Blazer has a front power bias, more powerful motor up front, relatively small motor in the back. This is the opposite, bigger motor in the back, smaller motor up front. You can get the Blazer as a rear-wheel drive vehicle where performance is going to be largely similar to this. And of course, there's the upcoming Blazer EV SS, and that is going to have performance seemingly similar to the top-end version of the Lyriq. So there is a decent amount of overlap there. If you're looking at the Cadillac Optic, that is the smaller vehicle. It's going to be less expensive than this Lyriq. It's going to have less rear seat legroom, and it's going to have the smaller battery pack. And that smaller battery pack is going to have the same charge performance profile as the Equinox and, of course, the smaller battery in the Blazer. So those are the key things to keep in mind if you're looking at some of those other Ultium EVs. I think the first thing you'll notice when you hop inside the Lyriq is the more relaxed seating position than other Cadillac SUVs like the XT5 or XT6. The windshield, it's quite long. I actually can't reach the end of it sitting comfortably for me in this seat, and my legs are definitely out in front of me. You're definitely driving in more of a sedan-like driving position. The other thing that I noticed is that the seat bottom cushion is relatively flat and also a little bit shorter than I might like. We don't have any sort of thigh cushion extension here, but this model does feature adjustable lumbar support and the available massage functionality. You obviously won't find that in the base model, and the base model also won't get the powered memory-linked tilt telescopic steering column. When you jump in the back, you'll really notice the length and the width of the Lyriq, but let's talk about the length first. Again, if my head is back here on the head restraint, I'm looking through that window on the side, so I'm really quite far from the dashboard and the front of the vehicle. This has a huge airy feeling inside. Oddly enough, Cadillac does not use a traditional seat back for the driver and front passenger seat. You can see we have this sort of hard section here that is then covered in stitched material. That actually reduces the amount of space we get back here for legroom. We would have maybe about 3/4 of an inch extra legroom if they simply had a traditional seat back design. I'm a little bit disappointed by that because it does mean a little bit more of a limit when it comes to installing child seats. I'll show you that in just a moment. The big thing you'll really notice though, if you frequently put people in the middle seat, so this is a surprisingly comfortable middle seat. The middle seat bottom cushion is a little bit lower than the outboard seats, but it's wide enough that it doesn't feel weird. It doesn't feel like I'm sitting on two 2x4s or something like that, like you find in a lot of small vehicles. We also have a completely flat floor, so I have somewhere to put my legs and not straddling a big hump. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. As you can see, I have maybe about an inch and a half of legroom left. Decent amount of headroom. My hair is brushing the ceiling, but my head is not touching the ceiling back here. And this big panoramic moonroof has a power shade on it. The width of the rear bench is probably most obvious when you take a look at the armrest that folds out of the center here. It's nice and wide, the cups are side by side, and the shoulder belt, in case you're wondering, does come out of the seat back itself, not out of the ceiling. On the other hand, when it comes to the lower anchors for child seats, we have my least favorite design. You can see this bolster section actually sticks out kind of a bit, and you will feel that in your lower back. And then we have these little plastic doors, which you can remove. You can actually unsnap them from the vehicle, but they're likely to get lost, and they don't always unsnap in the most pleasing fashion. That gives you direct access to those ISOFIX or latch anchors down there. Thanks to the wide bench in the back, this is one of the few EVs that could comfortably accommodate 2 child seats and an adult in the rear. In fact, in the back, I could actually sit between 2 of these rear-facing Kiko child seats, which are among the largest convertible seats currently available in the US. But you'll notice that versus the Chevy Blazer, there's a little bit less clearance. So if you're a taller driver or you have a taller passenger and you do need to put a rear-facing seat behind you, you might want to consider the Blazer instead. It all has to do with the design of this rear seat back and this big bulky thing on the back of that seat back. It actually takes up about an inch of the critical dimension in this area because, you know, your knees are down here, much lower on the seat back. It does limit some legroom there, but the bigger impact with child seats is actually this upper section of the seat. Behind the power hatch, we find 28 cubic feet of storage capacity. You open the power hatch by clicking on the Cadillac logo, which is kind of a nice touch rather than finding a button on the back of the vehicle. This cargo area is not as square as it could be. If Cadillac really made this boxy SUV or boxy wagon-like, we probably could have had over 30 cubic feet of storage space, but you notice again, this hatch is actually a bit more horizontal than it is vertical there. And that means that in our 24-inch roller bag test, I was able to squeeze a few more bags in a BMW iX. The iX is really quite square for a modern EV, and this, again, it's a little bit more sportback-like. Also, it really appears that Cadillac was trying to reserve as much room as possible for the passengers inside. Again, the cabin is really quite long. A 22-inch roller bag like this could not be upright close to the hatch, as you can see right there. It just wouldn't close. You do have to squish it quite far back in the cargo area for you to actually put those kind of bags in the upright position. Going in for a closer look, we have those 60/40 folding rear seat backs there and a roller-style cargo cover. That's definitely my preference because it's going to be easier to stash away when you don't want it. And under the load floor, we have a relatively deep storage well right there. It's deep enough that you can sort of stuff a roller bag in there, but you can see it's not quite deep enough to actually close that lid on the roller bag and have another layer of luggage on top. Under here we find some awkward plastic dividers. I really wish they'd given us just a 2-stage load floor. I think that would have been a bit handier. And then inside this little zippered pouch, we find the included EVSE, or charge cord, with the vehicle. Let's go ahead and give that a look. This is the same Ultium dual voltage charge cord we find in other Ultium vehicles. This is a nice touch because even though this is not going to charge the battery at its fastest rate, this is still a 32 amp EVSE, so it's not an ultra slow one, and it means you can completely charge the battery from empty overnight in most situations. As we look around the interior, keep in mind this is a nearly fully loaded version of the Lyriq. Here you can see the solution to the lack of wiper in the back. It's the rear camera display, although I'd rather have a wiper and a mirror. Up here we have the controls for the optional power panoramic moonroof. As you can see, the big pane up front does not open completely. It stops a little bit more than halfway, likely to reduce buffeting. There's a big bar right there, and then we get a smaller pane in the back, but it doesn't extend to the rear passengers' heads. It does, however, have a power shade, and that is something that I really appreciate. And you can stop the shade wherever you want, of course. We have height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger. This model has the AKG speaker system on it, which I have to say is not my favorite. I know that a lot of folks have asked me recently about the AKG speaker system in this vehicle. You can see those speaker grills right down there on the doors. I just think that the sound feels just a little bit flat. It seems like there's something missing for some reason. I can't quite describe what I don't like about it, but I do prefer the sound systems in some of the other Ultium platform vehicles. I'm not quite clear what's going on here. If you want to know more, there are some detailed audio reviews out there about the AKG system in this car. This model has the light colored leather upholstery with that blue stripe right there in the middle. That's a nice touch. These seats are both heated and ventilated. As you can see, there's not a lot of bolstering going on the seat back or seat bottom cushion. Seat bottom cushion is relatively flat, as I said before. Moving over to the front doors, we find a high percentage of soft touch materials. Soft touch injection molded upper section there, stitched midsection of the door, real wood trim in the door, and you can see the seat controls are located on the door as well. That knob just in front of the seat back control, that's for the lumbar support as well as the seat massage. It's a little bit difficult to show you the ambient lighting because it's a little bright outside, but we do have adjustable ambient lighting in here as well. If we move over to the dashboard, you'll notice that we get that really long dashboard design that we see in some EVs. That's, of course, for aerodynamics because they really want that really sloping windshield. We have a soft touch, sort of rubbery injection molded upper section of the dash, and then some stitched materials right here in the middle. The glove compartment, that's down there, but the button, it's over here on the screen. I will talk about that in just a second. When you're parked, it's easily available. And we have a bin-style glove compartment. I was able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. The air vents, they're not directed on the screen. We have these little knobs right here. You move move the air vent around with that knob, and then you open and close the vent by rotating that around. We have two air vents over there for the passenger, and then here in the middle, this is really more of a driver-focused air vent. It looks a little bit different than those others. It's kind of long and wide. I wish it was a bit more of a traditional vent design. I did notice that this Lyriq seems to have the one problem where the air conditioning does not blow as much cold air as you might like. Apparently that is adjustable via a software update coming soon, so it's something that Cadillac apparently does know about. Now up here, of course, you have the big reason to get the Lyriq over other Ultium vehicles, and that is we still get Apple CarPlay, something that we don't find in the newer Ultium vehicles and likely will not survive the expected upcoming refresh of the Lyriq. So if you want a Lyriq with CarPlay or Android Auto, you're going to want to act fast because this is probably something going away. One cool touch with the way that GM does CarPlay in their systems, and this is not just this vehicle, it's any GM vehicle with this eccentrically shaped screen in CarPlay, is you'll notice the background here is actually being generated by the iPhone. So when I go to the native interface, it's going to use the entire screen. CarPlay is not designed to use a curved screen like that, so the solution is we project a rectangular display in the middle, and then it color matches things going there. What's also cool about the CarPlay implementation here is that if I go over to this touch bank over here on this side of the screen, this is actually a really big touch screen. Here we go. We'll go projection. You can actually see that this map display is being driven by Apple CarPlay. So this is a really elegant two-screen implementation of CarPlay. And of course, if you'd rather have Google Maps over here and CarPlay Maps over there, you can select that as well. But back to this main screen. One thing worth noting is that if you're driving, this little button right here for opening the glove compartment, that is not available. You actually have to dig through the touchscreen for the passenger to open the glove compartment. I think that is a little bit silly. The software is, of course, the built-in Android-based operating system. We find climate control controls there, duplicates of what's going on below. We have things like the Google Assistant, the Google Maps, the Play Store. You can get Waze built in here, as a Wi-Fi hotspot, etc. One nice touch is that you can actually download other themes. Unfortunately, you have to purchase them through the My Cadillac app. And since I don't have that app registered with the vehicle, I can't actually show you that, but that is something you can do. And then you adjust the drive modes right there. Below that screen, we have the physical controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control system. These are the front two-zone controls there. If you want to control the third zone in the back, you have to do that with the touch screen. Here we have a sort of damped little compartment where you can store glasses. It's not very deep, so aside from glasses, you're not really going to be able to put a lot in there. This little panel down here was not sticking out quite as much as that before, but it was sticking out, and I think it's because a lot of people get into the car and they're like, what is this panel? This one opens, why doesn't that one open? And I did notice that at the dealers, they were all a little bit tighter, but the dealer said that a lot of folks actually end up pulling on that, and so they do a lot of repairs because of that design. I kind of wish Cadillac had designed that differently. Below that, we have a single USB charge-only port. Large amount of storage going on right there. You see this is a stitched panel that's kind of attractive with that blue contrast. Here in the middle we find more wood trim, 2 big cup holders. You can lower that little divider if you want to use that for your smartphone or something like that. We have a roller volume control over here. Lots of shiny black plastic. It does look like it's getting a little bit scratched. Controls for that infotainment system. If you'd rather use that controller knob, you can do that. Some folks were asking me if I thought that this knob felt cheap. Honestly, I don't think it does. I don't think any of these controls necessarily feel any different than they should be in here. We have a stitched cover to the center armrest. If I pull that open, we have a Qi wireless charging slot, but you can also connect your smartphone for smartphone projection via that USB port right here in the center console. This storage area is not as deep as I thought it should be. I did kind of expect that to be a little bit deeper. The Lyriq we're looking at today has the optional Super Cruise system, so we have the driver monitoring camera there and the LED light bar for Super Cruise here. It's dressed up a little bit with an extra little metal strip right there between the Super Cruise light bar and the leather wrapping on the steering wheel. As you can see, the rest of the steering wheel features a lot of shiny black plastic. This actually spans from one side to the other and includes these touch button banks on either side and even this split bottom spoke right there. This not only shows fingerprints easily, but it also appears to scratch. I already see some fine scratching on that plastic. We have track up, down there, voice command buttons, etc. Volume is a toggle over here. We then have a little control for choosing the input for your infotainment system over there. On this side, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system or Super Cruise, depending on the version you're looking at. And remember that the base model does not get adaptive cruise control. Then on the back of the steering wheel, we have a paddle for regenerative braking. What's different versus some Ultium vehicles is that this is not on-off. It actually is pressure sensitive, so how hard you pull it is how much regen braking you get, and it will take you to a complete stop and then hold you there. We then have the same switch gear, turn signal stalks, and shifters that we find in other vehicles from GM lately. They've really decided to move back to column shifters in a big way. Park is the button at the end. We then pull forward for drive, and then pull forward and then up for reverse. One pedal driving is adjusted via the controls on the touchscreen infotainment system, but keep in mind it's not going to affect the amount of regenerative braking you get because this has a blended braking system. So when you put your foot on the brake pedal, you are commanding regen up until the limit of regen when it's going to start using the friction brakes. You also have the option of, again, that one paddle drive right here. As we get the Lyriq out on the road, keep in mind this is not only bigger than average, it's heavier than average for this segment as well, but it still feels pretty peppy. This model weighs over 5,800 pounds as equipped, and with the average driver in it, it's going to be about 6,000 pounds. 0 to 60 in this model took 4.7 seconds. If you want to go a little bit faster, you can get that torque upgrade, and that will drop the 0 to 60 time down to 4.4 seconds. My best run in this was about 4.6 seconds. It's just right there around 4.69, 4.68 seconds, somewhere around there. So not exactly the fastest entry in this segment, but thanks to that strong rear power bias, it's pretty quick and it's also pretty fun. You'll notice that like many EVs, it doesn't ramp up to its maximum horsepower output until you're going, looks like maybe about 36 miles an hour or so. So that's one of the big differences you see in some of the ultra quick acceleration times in other modern EVs, is that they're simply ramping that power up faster. And Cadillac took a little bit more of a cautious approach, and they ramp power a little bit more gently. There are multiple different drive modes, but none of the drive modes had any impact on actual 0 to 60 times. The throttle mapping changes around a little bit, and it does make it feel a bit jumpier or a little bit less jumpy, but it doesn't actually change your 0 to 60 time. Now, in our braking testing, this actually surprised me a bit, again, given that this weighs so much. We actually measured 121 feet from 60 miles an hour to 0, and our longest stopping distance after repeated braking, because I was interested in that, was 130 feet. And that was after 10 repeated braking sessions. So brake fade was actually pretty reasonable, given the fact that this does weigh a reasonable amount. If you get the base model, it's probably going to take a little bit longer to stop because that does have narrower tires, and they are a slightly different tire than we find on this model as well. Handling, it's actually pretty decent, but clearly the curb weight does affect the handling score, so I'm going to give this a B. We have that strong rear power bias, and I think Cadillac did a good job making everything work together here. You can really tell as you go around the corner that they're definitely sending more power to the rear. The suspension kind of hunkers down, goes around that corner nicely, but it's not going to be as dynamic as something lighter, like that Tesla that just passed, of course. That's definitely on the light side of the segment. You'll actually notice, interestingly enough, that depending on the version you're looking at, a Tesla Model Y can actually be less heavy than some of the ICE counterparts that it cross-shops with. This, on the other hand, is definitely going to be heavier than average, and a lot of that has to do simply with the Ultium platform design. Because General Motors wanted a high degree of interchangeability when it comes to components, specifically the battery modules, the battery pack and all of its protection and its racking system, etc., all of that just weighs more than a lot of the comparable, less serviceable batteries in this segment. GM really is a very conservative design company, and even though it is incredibly uncommon to service an electric vehicle battery, they really wanted this battery to be dealer serviceable and then ultimately repairable. So those modules can then be sent back to General Motors, they could be inspected and repaired, etc. But more importantly, the battery modules themselves could be swapped with other modules in the future. The downside is the curb weight that we find in not only the Lyriq, but also the rest of the Ultium lineup. If you want something a little lighter and a little bit more efficient, you could choose the rear-wheel drive model, but the difference is not enormous because these motors are actually pretty darn efficient, all things considered. Now, out on this windier section of the road here where things are narrower, you will definitely notice the long wheelbase in the Lyriq. Long wheelbases have pros and cons. It really gives this an excellent feel out on the road in terms of ride quality and handling, etc. But on a narrower road like this, it certainly feels a little on the large side, and it's not going to turn quite as tightly as vehicles with a smaller wheelbase. One of the best things about the Lyriq is the ride quality. Even with the 40 series tires that we have on this has 22-inch wheels on it, ride quality is still surprisingly good. I actually was really eager to revisit this after recently driving the Acura ZDX, because the ZDX has an adaptive air suspension, something that we don't actually find on the Cadillac. It's the only Ultium platform vehicle so far that's not a truck that has the adaptive air suspension system. And it doesn't necessarily ride any better than this, interestingly. I do like, its ride quality on potholes and things like that a little bit better than the Lyriq, but I think this regular steel spring suspension was actually probably the right way to go, because long term this is going to be less expensive to keep around than an adaptive air suspension system, and it does a shockingly good job of controlling nearly 6,000 pounds worth of SUV even on a rougher road surface like this. Back out on the paved road, we measured 69 decibels at 50 miles an hour, easily making this one of the quietest vehicles we've ever tested. And you can likely thank that big battery pack there and just the amount of sound deadening we find in the Lyriq. There are no squeaks, there are no rattles. This feels incredibly solid, even on off-camber situations where it's, kicking a wheel up in the air because the platform is so stiff and there's not a lot of suspension travel compared, of course, to a Hummer. It's still really quiet. There's no creaking, no groaning, nothing like that going on in here, even though we do have that big hatch in the back. The major and obvious downside to not only the size of the Lyriq, but the curb weight of the Lyriq is fuel efficiency. We've been averaging 2.3 to 2.4 miles per kilowatt hour this week over about 400 miles of mixed driving. My best run was 2.7 miles per kilowatt hour. According to the EPA, this is going to average around 2.9. So I have definitely been getting lower than average numbers, but keep in mind that I live in a hilly and mountainous area, so a lot of mountain pass driving has been happening this week. You will certainly find more efficient EVs out there. Although most of those EVs are not going to be as big and as comfortable as the Lyriq, they are going to be notably more efficient. And remember that efficiency is not just about cost, it's also about charging times. The more efficient the EV, the less time you have to spend at a charger to get 50, 100, or 200 miles of range out of the vehicle. For most folks, I think it's going to be an okay trade-off, but it's certainly a trade-off that you have to keep in mind. Also keep in mind that something like a Tesla Model X, keep in mind it starts as a two-row vehicle, it is going to be more efficient than the Lyriq. It's not an enormous amount of difference in our testing, but it is still going to be more efficient. It looks a little bit more like a jelly bean. That's something to keep in mind as well, but unquestionably it's going to get you further on a charge. And it's also going to charge a little bit faster. The move towards electrification and the added curb weight that it results in is not really a great fit for every brand out there. But oddly enough, for Cadillac, I think it fits the personality of at least what a Cadillac is in my mind, because I love the traditional Cadillac of a supple ride, a quiet cabin, comfortable seats, gadgets, etc. That's what I'm after, and this does exactly that. The ride quality is fantastic. Obviously, it gives up handling in order to get that ride quality. And of course, the curb weight has some effect on that handling ability as well also, but it's not a wet noodle out on the road. You can have a surprising amount of fun, just not as much fun as you will have in some of the competition. Now, as we dive into that competition, keep in mind that this specific Lyriq MSRP'd for $77,770, but as we're going to talk about in a bit, it qualifies for the full federal tax credit.
Now let's talk about 2025 pricing. Well, for the Lyriq at least, because 2025 pricing is not available for all of the entries that you see on your screen, but it is out for the Lyriq, and there are some important things to know. The first one is the base model that I referenced very briefly at the beginning of the video. It's actually gone for 2025. And some folks might be upset by that, but I think most people will be okay because what Cadillac did was they reshuffled the lineup and they made most of the other versions actually less expensive, up to $2,700 less. So for 2025, the pricing ranges from around $59,990, including destination, on up to about $78,000. We don't have exact pricing details by the time I'm recording this video, but we know that the top trim in 2024 topped out at $79,580, and it looks like even that fully loaded model is going to get a little bit less expensive. When it comes to competition, the Lyriq appears difficult to categorize. If you're talking about Tesla categories, that is, and bear in mind, Tesla accounts for over half of all the EVs sold in North America, so it is logical to think of it that way. However, it's also about the same size as a Polestar 3 or an Audi SQ8 or a Q8 e-tron, etc. A decent number of the European options have this sort of mid-size two-row EV offering. And that's the important thing to know about the Cadillac electric lineup. Cadillac is trying to really blanket the lineup with electric offerings, from the upcoming small Optic. It's going to be smaller than the Lyriq. We then have the Vistic, which is kind of sort of an electric XT6, and then we have a full electric version of the Escalade. It's not a converted Escalade, it's actually another reimagined Escalade, and that's before we even get into the Celestiq and the upcoming Soleil convertible. So Cadillac really is trying to cover all of the bases with an electric option. And in the Tesla lineup, we have sort of a mainstream compact crossover sized thing in the Model Y. It's really trying to be a very direct BMW X3 competitor. And then we have the Tesla Model X, which is available as a 2 or a 3-row EV. And it's worth noting that the only Model X that will get the tax credit is the 2-row version. You cannot get a 3-row model with the tax credit because it gets too expensive. But of course, we also have the Polestar 3, the BMW iX, which is a bit boxier, the Q8 e-tron, the Mercedes EQS SUV, the ZDX, the close Acura relative, and then something like the Genesis GV70 as well. So with that in mind, let's roll through the competition. Actually, before I do that, let's talk about how the Cadillac lineup stacks up. Just generally speaking here, the Optic is going to start around $53,000. The Lyriq starts at around $60,000. We don't have pricing on the Vistic yet. Should be around $80,000 starting. Escalade IQ starts at $128,000. And if you want a Celestiq, that's going to be at least $250,000, with the upcoming Celestiq convertible being more expensive than that. So now let's roll through the competition. First one we clearly need to talk about is the Chevy Blazer EV, because it's very closely related. We get the same battery pack available, and the pricing really bookends the Lyriq. So you can spend up to about the same amount currently in your Blazer as where the Lyriq starts, but there's going to be some overlap once we get the more powerful versions of the Blazer. The Blazer SS is coming, and that's going to use basically the dual motor setup that we find from the Lyriq with the dial turned up a little bit further. But the battery pack and a lot of the performance figures are not going to be too far off where we find the Cadillac. The big differences between these two vehicles really are the polish level and some gadgets. So on the outside, we get the much more expressive full LED front end with those animated lights. We get the cooler LEDs. I think I like the shape of the Lyriq a bit more than the shape of the Blazer. We also find a much nicer interior. And I know that some people give Cadillac a hard time here and there for sharing parts, but unquestionably the fit and finish and the parts quality is better in the Lyriq. And that's simply due to the kind of designs that they chose to use on the inside and, of course, the particular parts improvements as well. I also came to really appreciate the variable regen paddle that we have in the Cadillac. That's a bit different than the one that we find in the Blazer. And importantly, you can get Super Cruise in your Lyriq today. Now, that's not the biggest differentiator because tomorrow you'll be able to get Super Cruise in the Blazer. It is orderable at the moment as we understand it, but it seems really hard to actually find, or maybe impossible even, I should say, to find a Blazer with Super Cruise right now. They've been promising it for a while. It appears that for 2025 you can order it. Details are a little bit sketchy, but you can run down to a Cadillac dealer and actually get a Lyriq today with Super Cruise on board. Range and efficiency pretty similar between these two models. Next up, we have the Audi Q8 e-tron. My mind immediately went to the Q8 when I drove the Lyriq, the first time and the second time here as well. And a lot of that has to do with the relatively similar dimensions, the similar profile of the vehicles, and the weight profile as well. They're both relatively heavy EVs in this luxury segment. And that's not something we find in the Tesla lineup. The Model Y and the Model X, they're really quite light when you talk about what they are. The Q8 is relatively heavy because it has a big battery and because it's a converted platform. So it's built on one of the Audi Volkswagen multi-use platforms with some definite substantive changes for electrification, but a lot of that bulk and the design for that gas platform remains in the Q8. And the downside to that is that the Q8 is not as space efficient as the Lyriq and not as space efficient as some folks might want. But it is an awful lot of fun to drive, and I think that I like that blend of features in some of these converted EVs. I like the bigger car feeling and the more traditional vibe that we get in the Q8. Unfortunately, this path to electrification does seem to have some compromises when it comes to efficiency. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. Of course, it also has some compromises when it comes to the price tag because you can get your Q8, SQ8 I should say, up over $100,000. Definitely more expensive than the Cadillac Lyriq. And no version is going to qualify for the federal tax credit, not just because it's too expensive, but because of where the Q8 is built. That brings us along to the Tesla we should talk about, which I truly think is the Tesla Model X. The Model X two-row gets the tax credit if we're talking about the Model X without too many options. And size-wise, it's closer to the Lyriq than the Lyriq is to the Model Y. Although practicality, that is a bit trickier because the Model Y is really well packaged. It has a shorter hood kind of profile. We have an actual front trunk in there, something that we don't find in the Cadillac. But when it comes to the build quality of the interior and I would say the parts quality as well, I do think that the Cadillac feels nicer. Some of the premium materials that we find lower on the dashboard components are nicer than the Tesla Model Y. But honestly, this is all going to be personal preference. More similar, I think, is the ride quality and the nature of the vehicle. The Lyriq may not have an air suspension like we find in the Model X, but the two vehicles were designed to be a bit more grown-up in their feel. The Model X has a much better ride quality than we find in the Model Y. Model Y is still pretty firmly sprung for my tastes. The Cadillac and the Model X, they're a little bit more on the comfortable side of things. So if you want a more comfortable ride, both are going to be an excellent option. Of course, faster charging is going to happen on the Tesla Model X. This is actually one of the fastest charging vehicles on the market, even though it's actually been one of the fastest charging vehicles for quite some time. And that's because other car companies have not been quite as aggressive at their charge profiles as Tesla has been. And it's worth noting that the Model X is pretty efficient thanks to its jelly bean-like profile. As long as we're not talking about the ultra-fast top-end Plaid model, which in real-world driving definitely comes down from those lofty EPA estimates, the Model X is still going to be quite efficient when compared against something like the Cadillac Lyriq. Price-wise, of course, the Model X is a bit more expensive, and there isn't going to be as much cash on the hood. So in a lot of ways, the Model X and the Model Y, I mean, they're really two ends opposite where we find the Lyriq. And in some ways, the Lyriq is between these two worlds, if that makes sense. Next up, let's talk about the other close competitor we must talk about, and that is the Acura ZDX. It's basically the Acura Lyriq. It's built by General Motors for Acura, and it's an interesting combination of parts from the rest of the lineup. We don't find a big single screen in the dashboard. I think that would have made too much sense, to be honest. Kind of wish Acura had begged for one of those, because the interior comes across as less premium and a little bit less fancy, I would say, as not just the Lyriq, but actually also the Chevy Blazer, because of the way the displays are arranged and the size of the displays. They could be bigger, in my opinion. On the other hand, the Acura has a really nice ride quality thanks to its active air suspension, something that we don't find in the Cadillac, even though it was designed and developed by General Motors for the Ultium platform. We probably will see an air suspension in something later on in the General Motors Ultium vehicle lineup, probably something like the Vistic, but we don't have too much visibility on that just yet. The air suspension gives the ZDX the ability to change personalities a bit more. It has a really good ride quality, but it can get a little firmer than the Lyriq and a little bit softer than the Lyriq as well. Acura also borrowed Caddy's Super Cruise system, so if you want the best of all these worlds in a way, I think it might be the ZDX. I like the interior design better in the Lyriq, and I like the front-end design better in the Lyriq, but I think that the ride quality, the adaptive suspension system, the fact that we have smartphone projection giving customers what they want, and the rear-end styling I think are all better in the Acura. But for me, the toughest competitor for the Lyriq I think actually is the Genesis GV70, and I have to admit that this came to my brain a little bit late in my driving process, which is why I didn't mention it too much in the video. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, if I was going to buy a Lyriq, I would probably really also check out the GV70, mainly because it's really quick, it's really comfortable, and it charges wicked fast. It's not as big on the inside, though. This is another converted EV platform thing, although the changes that Genesis made to the electric GV70 from the regular GV70 are more substantive than the changes that we find in the Q8. They really restructured the floor pan quite considerably to package that battery under there. And it's also a weird turducken of an electric car because they grabbed the eGMP internals from the GV60 and the Ioniq 5, etc., and they jammed them into the rear-wheel drive Genesis platform. So it looks and feels like a regular Genesis vehicle on the outside. I actually kind of like that part. But it charges really quickly. You can go 10% to 80% in just about 20 minutes or under. And most importantly, you can go 0 to 100% in about the same time that it would take the Lyriq to go 10% to 80%, to just get a 70% charge. And that has a big impact on road trips. Yes, the real-world range of the GV70 electrified is below the real-world range of the Lyriq. But if you're on a road trip, if you're going 400, 500 miles, it may actually take you less time to drive that in the GV70 than in the Cadillac, because you would be able to stop every 150 miles or so, and in just about 15 minutes you would get nearly a 70% improvement in your charge. And the charge curve on this is absolutely fantastic. So it doesn't really matter whether you drop in at 0% or 10% or even 20%. Gaining a 70% charge at any of those profiles is really, really rapid. Even going all the way up to 100% again is super duper quick. So for a lot of folks, that could eliminate the worries about range because you can just get where you need to go so much faster without spending as much time at that supercharger or DC fast charger station. If my money were on the line, I would be looking really closely at that GV70. The exceptions would be if you're looking for longer range in a single charge. You're definitely going to find that in the Cadillac lineup. Also, there is the rear-wheel drive option in the Lyriq. All GV70 electrifieds are dual motor only. And of course, if you want the deal, because there is a lot of cash on the hood of the Lyriq. Right now, you could easily find $10,000, $15,000 easy discount on the Lyriq. And we just don't find that discount really on any of the other options that we've talked about, except for the Blazer and the Acura ZDX, interestingly enough. And I think that's just down to the design of these vehicles, the fact that they're built in the United States so they can get the $7,500 credit. So all of that means that it's just a little bit easier to put cash on the hood. And indeed, we see a lot of cash going on. Let me know what you would think about that down there in the comment section below. What would you buy? Would you be interested in a Model Y because it's going to be less expensive, it's going to be faster, it's going to be easy to find? Or would you be willing to really work the deals and maybe get a Lyriq for less money and have something a bit different? You could certainly find an average Lyriq, I would say, out there on the streets, on the lot for less than the base price of a Model Y, but it's going to require some legwork. Or would you be interested in something like the Genesis GV70? Let me know what you think about that down there, and I'll see all of you later.